Gold has toppled empires. Oil has built them. Diamonds, land, armies, even entire peoples all have been counted as wealth. A king once gave away so much gold that the price of it collapsed across a continent. An emperor claimed ownership of an entire nation's grain, feeding millions at his whim. A banker quietly decided who would rule Europe, and a warlord who owned no palace commanded more land than any monarch alive. They were not simply rich, they were the richest to ever live. Men whose fortunes were so vast that their names blurred into legend, fortunes built on conquest, on trade, on empire, and on blood. This is not a list of billionaires. This is not Forbes. This is history's true elite, the 10 richest people to ever walk the earth. For thousands of years, wealth has shaped history. Empires rose and fell on it. Wars were fought over it. Religions and philosophies struggled to define it. And across the ages there have been men whose fortunes were so vast, so unthinkable, that even today their names echo with power. But wealth has never meant one thing. Sometimes it was counted in coins, in jewels, in diamonds piled high in royal treasuries. Sometimes it was land, armies, slaves, or cattle. And sometimes wealth was simply power, the ability to command millions, to direct the flow of trade, to bend the course of history itself. Tonight we count down the 10 richest people to ever live. Men who reigned over empires, built industries, and controlled resources on a scale beyond imagination. Before there was a Khan, before there was even a boy named Temujin, there was the steppe. Stretching from the edge of Europe across Mongolia to the Pacific, the Eurasian steppe was a world of grass and sky. Life here was nomadic. Families lived in felt tents called gers, round structures that could be dismantled, packed onto carts, and moved wherever the herds needed pasture. Wealth was measured not in gold or jewels, but in animals, horses, sheep, goats, yaks, camels. A man with 10,000 horses was rich beyond measure. Around 1162, in this world of shifting tribes and open grasslands, a child was born. His name was Temujin, which means blacksmith. Legend says that when he was born, he clutched a blood clot in his fist, a sign that he was destined for greatness. From the beginning, Temujin's life was marked by struggle. His father was poisoned by rival Tatars when Temujin was still a boy. Leaderless, the family was abandoned by their clan. Stripped of protection, they were left to survive alone on the open steppe. This was Temujin's childhood. Not the privilege of kings, not the security of empires, but the unforgiving reality of the steppe. Hunger, betrayal, and the need to fight for survival shaped the boy into the man who would one day command the largest empire the world had ever seen. Slowly, Temujin gained power. Clan by clan, tribe by tribe, he gathered men under his banner. By 1206 he had achieved what no one before him had. He united the Mongol tribes. At a great council, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan, universal ruler. What made the Mongols unstoppable was not just ferocity, it was method. The Mongol warrior was above all else a horseman. Each soldier owned several horses, rotating between them to cover vast distances. In a single day, a Mongol army could travel 80 miles, double or triple the speed of European forces. Their weapon was the composite bow made of wood, horn, and sinew, and it was small enough to fire from horseback but powerful enough to pierce armor at 200 yards. A skilled archer could fire 6 arrows a minute while galloping. After uniting the Mongols, Genghis Khan turned outward. His first target was the Xia dynasty of northern China, then the Jin dynasty. But his greatest vengeance came against the Khwarezmian Empire in Persia. City after city fell: Bukhara, Samarkand, Nishapur. By the time of his death in 1227, Genghis Khan's empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. Unlike emperors in palaces or industrial magnates with bank accounts, Genghis did not measure riches in gold. He wore simple clothes, ate the food of his men, and slept in felt tents. His treasure was not stored in vaults but distributed among his soldiers and families. And yet his wealth was unmatched. He commanded resources across Asia. Tribute flowed from China, Persia, and Central Asia. His empire controlled the Silk Road itself. the arteries of Eurasian trade. By modern standards, some estimate the economic output of his empire at trillions of dollars. But perhaps the truest measure of his wealth is this: he controlled the lives of nearly 100 million people, a quarter of the world's population. The morning mist clung to the hills of southern England on October 14, 1066. At the top of Senlac Hill, the English shield wall stood tight. Below, the Normans shifted nervously, their horses stamping and snorting. In the center of the Norman line sat a man on horseback who had been mocked as a boy, called William the Bastard, dismissed by nobles who thought him unworthy of rule. But on this day he would seize a crown with blood and steel. William was born in 1028, the illegitimate son of Duke Robert I of Normandy and a tanner's daughter. When his father died in 1035, William, at just 7 years old, inherited the duchy. Almost immediately, chaos erupted. Norman nobles looked at the boy and saw weakness. They mocked him as William the Bastard. Yet William survived. As he matured, he understood something crucial. Survival wasn't just about the sword. It was about politics. His greatest alliance came through marriage to Matilda of Flanders, daughter of Count Baldwin V. This union tied Normandy to one of Europe's most powerful territories. William's eyes turned beyond Normandy to England. King Edward the Confessor had no children, creating a succession crisis. Norman chroniclers insisted that Edward promised the throne to William. When Edward died in January 1066, Harold Godwinson was crowned king. To William, this was treachery. William moved quickly. He secured backing from the Pope, who sent him a banner as a sign of divine approval. He summoned his vassals and allies. Ships were built, knights gathered. In September 1066, his fleet set sail, hundreds of ships carrying thousands of men. At Hastings, the battle that would change England forever was fought. For hours, the English shield wall held firm. But as the day wore on, the English grew tired. By evening, the decisive blow came. Harold Godwinson fell, and with him, the spirit of his army. William stood victorious. The crown of England was his for the taking. On Christmas Day, 1066, William was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey. But William wasted no time consolidating his hold. He rewarded his followers with English land, dispossessing Anglo-Saxon nobles. Castles sprang up across the country, symbols of Norman dominance. William's genius was in how he thought of wealth. For him, England was not just a kingdom to rule. It was an estate to own. He declared that all land in England ultimately belonged to him. Nobles held it only as tenants in exchange for loyalty and service. In 1086, he ordered the Domesday Book, a massive survey of his kingdom. Officials recorded every manor, every field, every pig, cow, and chicken. The Domesday Book was not just an administrative feat. It was a mirror of William's fortune. Every entry a reminder that all of it, in the end, flowed upward to him. Through the Domesday Book, we see the scale of it. Over 5,000 estates recorded, hundreds of mills, fisheries, vineyards, and towns. Tens of thousands of villagers, serfs, and slaves. All of it ultimately William's. By claiming ownership of every acre, William created a personal fortune unparalleled in medieval Europe. Estimates place his wealth in modern terms at over $200 billion. His wealth was an entire country. Picture a hall in Augsburg, early 16th century. The smell of wax and parchment fills the air. Merchants shuffle nervously, hats in hand. At the center, a man sits behind a heavy table, his quill poised, his ledgers open. Yet outside these walls, kings wait for his decision. Emperors kneel for his loans. Popes whisper prayers that his money will flow their way. This man is not a king. He commands no armies. He builds no castles. And yet, his wealth is so vast, his influence so absolute, that entire thrones tremble when he closes his book. His name is Jakob Fugger. They called him Jakob the Rich. Jakob was born in 1459 into a family of weavers in Augsburg. The Fuggers had already built wealth through textiles, but it would be Jakob who transformed them into Europe's bankers. As a young man, Jakob was sent to Venice, the beating heart of European trade. There he absorbed the lessons of Venetian finance. double-entry bookkeeping, credit systems, international bills of exchange. Jacob's genius was to expand beyond textiles into money itself. He lent to bishops, dukes, and kings. In return, he demanded not just repayment but privileges, mining rights, monopolies, political favors. He financed silver and copper mines in Tyrol and Hungary, the largest metal industries of their time, but his most famous loans were to rulers. When Charles V sought election as Holy Roman Emperor in 1519, Jacob bankrolled him, providing over 500,000 florins, the equivalent of hundreds of millions today. With Fugger's money, Charles bought the votes of electors and became ruler of Spain, the Americas, and much of Europe. Jacob Fugger, the son of weavers, had decided who would rule an empire. For all his brilliance, Fugger's methods were controversial. At the heart of his fortune lay a practice the church had long condemned, lending money at interest, usury. But Jacob faced this accusation head-on, writing to Pope Leo X that interest was simply the fair price of risk and opportunity. The Pope listened, and the church softened its stance. By the time of his death, Jacob's personal fortune was estimated at 2% of Europe's entire GDP, equivalent to hundreds of billions of dollars today. Unlike William the Conqueror or Genghis Khan, Fugger did not own land through conquest. His wealth was more liquid, more subtle. It flowed in silver from mines, in trade from the Mediterranean, in interest from kings and popes. When Jacob Fugger died in 1525, he left behind more than personal wealth. He had reshaped Europe's financial system. He normalized interest, helped create modern banking, and showed that money could be more powerful than armies. The flames danced high against the Roman sky. Smoke billowed from the insulae, the crowded apartment blocks where the city's poor lived stacked like kindling. Women screamed from upper windows. Men shouted desperately for water that would not come. And in the street below, a man watched, calm, patient, calculating. His name was Marcus Licinius Crassus. He commanded a private fire brigade, the only organized firefighters in Rome. But his men did not move. They stood with buckets and ladders waiting. The building owner ran to him, panic in his eyes. "Please," he begged, "save my property." Crassus smiled. "Of course, for a price." The negotiation was swift. The owner, watching his investment burn, agreed to sell at a fraction of the building's worth. Only then did Crassus nod to his men. Only then did the water flow. This was how the richest man in Roman history built his fortune. One fire, one desperate seller, one calculated purchase at a time. Marcus Licinius Crassus was born around 115 BC into a world of conquest and chaos. The Roman Republic was groaning under the weight of empire. Rome had no fire department, no police force, no public services as we understand them. Private enterprise filled the gaps. In 87 BC, when Crassus was in his 20s, civil war erupted. His father and brother were executed. Their property was confiscated. Crassus fled Rome and hid in a cave on the Spanish coast for 8 months. But exile taught him patience. When he returned to Rome, he was no longer the young aristocrat who had fled. He was a survivor, hardened by loss, determined never to be powerless again. Rome's chaos became Crassus's opportunity. Fire was Rome's greatest fear. The city was built of wood, packed tight, with no municipal firefighting service. Crassus saw opportunity in this terror. He recruited and trained a private fire brigade of over 500 men. But they did not rush to every blaze. They waited for Crassus's signal, and Crassus did not give that signal until he had negotiated a purchase. The system was ruthless, but legal. A burning building was worthless. A building that could be saved was still valuable. Property owners, watching their investments turn to ash, agreed to almost any terms. Crassus also became Rome's premier moneylender. He lent to senators, generals, and even provincial governors. His interest rates were competitive, his terms flexible. But every loan came with an invisible chain. Men who owed him money owed him favor. In 73 BC, his wealth would be tested in blood. A gladiator named Spartacus escaped from a training school in Capua, taking 73 fighters with him. Within months, Spartacus commanded an army of over 100,000 escaped slaves. Finally, the Senate turned to Crassus. The war was brutal, but Crassus was patient. He built walls to trap the rebels in southern Italy. The final battle came in 71 BC. Spartacus fell fighting. Crassus had won. His vengeance was calculated to terrify. 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way. By modern standards, some estimate his fortune at $400 billion. He owned entire districts of Rome. His slaves numbered in the thousands. His loans reached into every corner of Roman politics. But perhaps his greatest asset was information, knowledge of who owed whom, which properties were vulnerable, which politicians were desperate. Despite his political ambition, Crassus lived relatively simply. His house on the Palatine Hill was grand but not ostentatious. He preferred entertaining to display, yet those who knew him described a man driven by insecurity. Despite his wealth, despite his power, he never felt secure. In 54 BC, Crassus crossed the Euphrates with 7 legions, nearly 50,000 men. He sought military glory to match his wealth. Near the town of Carrhae, the Parthians struck. The battle was unlike anything in Roman experience. Wave after wave of arrows fell on the Roman formation. Of the 50,000 men who had crossed the Euphrates, barely 10,000 made it back to Syria. Crassus himself was killed during negotiations. Legend says the Parthians poured molten gold down his throat, mocking his legendary greed. The richest man in Rome died in the desert, his body lost to the sands of Mesopotamia. The sun rises over Fatehpur Sikri, casting long shadows across red sandstone courtyards. In the hall of private audience, a man sits cross-legged on cushions, surrounded by ministers, poets, and scholars. Jesuits debate with Muslim clerics. Hindu scholars argue with Zoroastrian priests. The emperor listens to all, questions each, and weaves their wisdom into the fabric of rule. This is Jalal ud-Din Muhammad, but history knows him as Akbar the Great. At the height of his reign, he commanded the allegiance of 100 million subjects, nearly a quarter of the world's population. His treasury held more gold than European kings could imagine. Under Akbar, the Mughal Empire became the world's richest realm. Akbar was born in 1542 during his family's desperate flight from enemies. The baby came into the world in the desert fortress of Umarkot. Legend says that when his father Humayun held his newborn son, he had no gold to distribute in celebration. Only musk, that precious aromatic that traders carried across Central Asia. Akbar's childhood was spent in exile and uncertainty. By the time Humayun recaptured Delhi in 1555, the Mughal Empire was a shadow of its former self. Then, in 1556, disaster struck again. Humayun fell down the stairs of his library and died. The empire passed to his 13-year-old son. Within months, Akbar faced his greatest test. At the Second Battle of Panipat, Akbar's forces met an Afghan army. Victory came through luck as much as skill. An arrow struck the enemy leader Hemu in the eye, and his army broke and fled. When urged to strike the final blow, the young emperor refused. He would not kill a wounded man. This moment, mercy shown to a defeated enemy, would define Akbar's reign. Where other conquerors ruled through fear, he would rule through inclusion. Akbar's method was revolutionary. Instead of governing conquered peoples, he made them partners in empire. Take his approach to the Rajputs, the warrior clans of Rajasthan. Previous Muslim rulers had tried to crush them or convert them. Akbar chose a different path. He negotiated marriages with Rajput princesses not as symbols of conquest but as political alliances. This policy, Sul-e-Kul, or peace with all, transformed the Mughal Empire. Instead of a Muslim kingdom ruling Hindu subjects, it became a multi-religious state where talent mattered more than birth or belief. With his political foundation secure, Akbar turned to expansion. His campaigns were methodical, almost industrial in their efficiency. Gujarat fell in 1573. Bengal surrendered in 1576. Kashmir submitted in 1586. By 1600, Akbar's empire stretched from the Khyber Pass to the Bay of Bengal. But what made Akbar wealthy was not just the size of his empire, but how he administered it. His finance minister revolutionized taxation with a system based on scientific measurement of agricultural yield. Surveyors mapped every field. Tax rates were set at fixed percentages that encouraged production rather than stifling it. Trade flourished under imperial protection. The Grand Trunk Road connected Bengal to Afghanistan. Ports were improved, weights and measures standardized. International commerce boomed. European merchants marveled at the wealth flowing through Mughal territories. The empire's annual revenue reached 100 million rupees, equivalent to hundreds of billions in today's currency. Contemporary estimates suggest that Akbar's personal wealth approached $21 trillion in modern terms. His treasury contained more gold and silver than existed in all of Europe. Akbar's court was part palace, part philosophical academy. He built a new capital at Fatehpur Sikri that blended Persian, Hindu, and Islamic architectural styles. Every evening, poets recited verses in multiple languages. Musicians performed ragas that blended traditions from across Asia. But Akbar's greatest intellectual achievement was his attempt to create a new religion, the Din-e-Ilahi, or divine faith. Drawing elements from Islam, Hinduism, Christianity, and Zoroastrianism, it was his effort to unite his diverse empire under a single spiritual banner. When Akbar died in 1605, he had transformed a failing dynasty into the richest empire on earth. He left his son an inheritance that European kings could barely imagine, a stable, prosperous, tolerant realm that would dominate global commerce for another century. Mist rises from the Yellow River as dawn breaks over the northern Song capital of Kaifeng. In the imperial palace, a young man sits reviewing reports from across his vast realm. Numbers flow across the pages like rivers, revenues that dwarf the treasuries of every other kingdom on earth. This is Emperor Shenzong, ruler of the Song dynasty, master of the most technologically advanced and economically productive empire in medieval history. Under his reign, China would reach heights of prosperity that Europe would not match for another 5 centuries. By the 11th century, the Song Empire had created the world's first recognizably modern economy. Paper money circulated alongside coins. State-issued credit notes facilitated long-distance trade. Joint stock companies raised capital for major ventures. The agricultural revolution underpinning this prosperity was staggering. New strains of rice from Vietnam allowed multiple harvests per year. Advanced irrigation systems brought previously unusable land under cultivation. The population had soared to over 100 million, larger than all of Europe combined. Industry was equally advanced. Song China produced more iron than the entire rest of the world. Coal mining supplied fuel for vast metalworking operations. Innovation drove this prosperity. Song inventors had created the compass, gunpowder, and movable type printing. But perhaps most importantly, the Song had created a merit-based civil service. Officials were selected through rigorous examinations rather than birth or connections. This created an administrative class capable of managing complexity on a scale no other civilization had attempted. When Zhao Shu ascended the throne as Emperor Shenzong in 1067, he inherited the world's greatest economy, but also its greatest dilemma. For all its wealth and sophistication, the Song was militarily vulnerable. To the north lay the Khitan Liao dynasty. To the northwest, the Tangut Western Xia kingdom. These neighbors were economically primitive compared to Song China, but their warrior cultures produced formidable armies. Shenzong's answer was systematic reform. He appointed Wang Anshi as his chief minister, who proposed the most ambitious economic reforms in Chinese history. The new policies were designed to unlock the empire's wealth for state purposes while improving the lives of ordinary people. The results were spectacular. By the peak of Shenzong's reign, the Song Empire was generating revenues equivalent to $30 trillion in modern terms, roughly 1/3 of current global GDP. The imperial treasury held reserves of silver that outweighed the entire money supply of medieval Europe. This was not just the wealth of a single man, but of an entire civilization at its economic peak. State granaries could feed the entire population for 3 years. Government workshops produced weapons, tools, and luxury goods on an industrial scale. Shenzong's daily life reflected both the sophistication and the burden of ruling such a complex realm. He rose each day at 5 a.m. for morning prayers and meditation. By 6 a.m. he was in council with his ministers, reviewing reports from across the empire. The volume was staggering. The Song bureaucracy processed more paperwork than any government in history. Despite commanding unprecedented wealth, Shenzong's personal lifestyle was relatively modest. Confucian ideology emphasized frugality and restraint. The emperor wore silk robes, ate from golden dishes, and lived in magnificent palaces, but avoided ostentatious display. The ultimate test of Shenzong's wealth came when he decided to use it for military expansion. Despite the success of his reforms, the fundamental strategic problem remained. China was rich, but surrounded by martial enemies who could exploit that wealth through tribute demands or outright invasion. The campaigns began in 1081 against the Western Xia Kingdom. Song armies were equipped with the finest weapons money could buy. They carried crossbows of unprecedented power, wore superior armor, and were supported by supply trains that could sustain operations across vast distances. But the campaigns revealed the limits of wealth as a substitute for military tradition. Song soldiers, raised in a peaceful commercial society, lacked the warrior culture of their enemies. The Western Xia, fighting for their homeland, proved more resilient than expected. The campaigns proved ruinously expensive. Emperor Shenzong, worn down by the stress of managing both domestic reforms and foreign wars, died in 1085 at age 38. His death marked the end of Song China's greatest expansion and the beginning of its long strategic decline. Yet even in failure, Shenzong's reign represented the high-water mark of Chinese prosperity. At its peak, the Song economy produced roughly 25–30% of global GDP, with a population representing about 15% of humanity. This level of economic dominance has never been matched. The fires are dying in the braziers outside the Senate House. Dawn creeps across the 7 hills of Rome, casting long shadows between the columns of temples and the arches of aqueducts. In a villa on the Palatine Hill, a man sits reading dispatches from the farthest corners of the known world. Reports arrive from Britain in the north, from Egypt in the south, from Germania in the east, from Spain in the west. Each scroll bears news of tribute collected, taxes levied, trade regulated, and prosperity maintained. The numbers are staggering. Revenues from 60 million subjects, the economic output of 3 continents, the accumulated wealth of 1,000 conquered cities. The man reading these reports is Caesar Augustus, master of the Roman world. When he signs a document, he moves resources that dwarf the treasuries of ancient kings. His birth name was Gaius Octavius Thurinus. He came into the world in 63 BC, the great-nephew of Julius Caesar. The boy was often ill, asthma, stomach ailments, recurring fevers. His frailty proved to be a gift. Unable to achieve glory through physical prowess, he developed the patience, calculation, and political instincts that would serve him throughout his life. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, everything changed. News of Caesar's assassination reached Octavius while he was studying in Apollonia. Friends and tutors urged caution. Rome was in chaos. The assassins controlled the capital. But Octavius, not yet 19, made a decision that revealed the steel beneath his frail exterior. He would return to Rome immediately and claim his inheritance. According to Caesar's will, he was now Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, heir to the greatest name in Rome. Caesar had left him a substantial personal fortune, but Octavian knew this was insufficient for the struggle ahead. He needed to claim his great-uncle's public wealth as well. The accumulated spoils of Gallic wars, Egyptian campaigns, and years of profitable governance. Within months, the sickly teenager had assembled resources that rivaled those of senior generals. He had turned inheritance into power, and power into the foundation of empire. The path to supreme power led through a series of civil wars. First came the alliance with Mark Antony and Lepidus, the second triumvirate. The triumvir's first task was revenge. They published prescription lists, death sentences for Caesar's assassins and their supporters. Hundreds were murdered, their property confiscated to fund the coming campaigns. But victory created new problems. The triumvirs now controlled the entire Roman world, but there was not room for three masters. The final confrontation came at sea. In 31 BC, at the Battle of Actium, Octavian's fleet met the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. Antony and Cleopatra escaped to Egypt, but their cause was hopeless. The following year, both committed suicide. At age 32, Octavian had achieved what no Roman before him had managed. He was sole master of the Mediterranean world. But Octavian's greatest achievement was not winning power, it was keeping it. In 27 BC, in a carefully staged ceremony, he restored the Republic, returning power to the Senate and people. It was a masterful piece of political theater. The Senate, grateful for the gesture, immediately begged him to reconsider. They granted him new powers, new titles, and a new name, Augustus, meaning the revered one. In reality, Augustus had sacrificed nothing. He retained control of the armies, the provinces, and the treasury. But by appearing to restore republican traditions, he satisfied conservative opinion while maintaining effective dictatorship. Augustus controlled the treasury of the Roman state, enriched by centuries of conquest. He possessed vast personal estates across the empire. More importantly, he commanded the economic output of 60 million subjects. Roman taxation was efficient and comprehensive. Every province contributed grain, silver, or manufactured goods. Augustus's personal fortune was estimated at 1.5 billion sestertii, roughly $4.6 trillion in modern terms. But this figure understates his true wealth, which included effective control over the entire Mediterranean economy. When Augustus wanted to build a forum, he purchased and demolished entire neighborhoods in central Rome. When disasters struck, floods, earthquakes, fires, he could rebuild entire cities from personal funds. Despite commanding unprecedented resources, Augustus lived with calculated modesty. His house on the Palatine Hill was grand but not ostentatious. He preferred dining with close friends to elaborate banquets. His clothing was typically Roman, togas woven by his wife and daughter. Augustus's greatest innovation was creating a system of government that could outlast any individual ruler. He established the Praetorian Guard, created the urban cohorts to maintain order, and reorganized the legions. More subtly, he developed a bureaucracy capable of managing complexity on an unprecedented scale. When Augustus died in 14 AD, after ruling for 45 years, he left behind more than personal wealth. He had created the institutional framework for Western civilization's first global empire. His funeral was a state ceremony of unprecedented magnificence, but his true monument was the system of government he had created. When we call Augustus the fourth richest person in history, we recognize not just his command of unprecedented resources, but his transformation of wealth into lasting power. Unlike conquerors whose empires died with them, Augustus created institutions that outlasted dynasties. The lamp burns low in the small office above a Cleveland warehouse. Outside, the sounds of a growing industrial city echo through the night. Inside, a young man sits hunched over ledgers, his pen scratching numbers across page after page of accounts. He is 24 years old, methodical, precise, obsessed with efficiency. Every penny is accounted for, every transaction recorded. His name is John Davison Rockefeller, and he has just invested in something that will change the world: oil. John Davison Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839 in Richford, New York. His father was a traveling salesman who sold patent medicines. His mother, Eliza, was a devout Baptist who instilled in her children an ironclad work ethic and unwavering religious faith. The family moved to Cleveland, Ohio, when John was 14. Cleveland in the 1850s was a boomtown. Canals connected it to eastern markets. Railroads linked it to the expanding West. John watched fortunes made and lost in grain speculation. He saw how those who controlled transportation commanded the greatest power. At 16, Rockefeller left school to seek employment. After weeks of searching, he found work as an assistant bookkeeper at 50 cents a day. He approached the job with characteristic intensity. He arrived early, stayed late, and absorbed every lesson the business offered. Within a few years, Rockefeller had saved enough money to enter business for himself. In 1859, at age 20, he formed Clark and Rockefeller, dealing in grain, hay, meat, and other agricultural products. The modern petroleum industry began in 1859 when Edwin Drake struck oil at Titusville, Pennsylvania. Most of the early oilmen focused on drilling, finding new wells, extracting crude oil from the ground. But Rockefeller, studying this new industry with his characteristic methodical approach, saw that the real opportunity lay not in drilling oil, but in refining it. Crude petroleum was useful only after it had been processed into kerosene for lighting, lubricants for machinery, and other refined products. The refining process was complex, requiring substantial investment in equipment and expertise. In 1863, Rockefeller invested in his first oil refinery. From the beginning, he approached oil refining differently than his competitors. While others focused on quick profits, he invested in the most efficient equipment available. While they competed purely on price, he emphasized quality and reliability. In 1865, at age 26, John D. Rockefeller had become the sole owner of Cleveland's largest oil refinery. He immediately began implementing the strategies that would make him the richest man in America. Rockefeller's approach to business was revolutionary in its systematic ruthlessness. His first principle was efficiency. He studied every aspect of the refining process, finding ways to reduce costs and increase output. But technology was only part of the equation. Rockefeller understood that in the oil business, transportation costs often exceeded production costs. He began negotiating secret deals with railroad companies, offering them guaranteed volumes of traffic in exchange for substantial discounts. These rebates, sometimes as much as 50% off standard shipping rates, gave Rockefeller enormous competitive advantages. By 1870, Rockefeller and Andrews had become the Standard Oil Company of Ohio, with capital of $1 million. But this was only the beginning. Rockefeller's next strategy was consolidation. One by one, he approached competing refineries with offers to buy them out. His terms were usually generous, but his message was clear: join Standard Oil voluntarily, or face inevitable bankruptcy through competition. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled 90% of America's oil refining capacity. It was the nation's first true monopoly, a corporate giant that dwarfed any business that had existed before. Standard Oil owned refineries across the country. It controlled thousands of miles of pipelines. It operated fleets of railroad tank cars. More importantly, Standard Oil had achieved vertical integration, controlling every stage of the oil business from production to retail sales. Rockefeller's personal wealth grew along with his company's dominance. By 1890, economists estimated his personal fortune at around $200 million, making him by far the wealthiest American of his era. As the 19th century ended and the 20th began, the automobile was transforming American society. Henry Ford's Model T brought car ownership within reach of ordinary Americans. Suddenly, the nation needed not just kerosene for lighting, but gasoline for transportation. Gasoline sales exploded. By 1910, Rockefeller's personal fortune approached $1 billion, an almost incomprehensible sum. To put this in perspective, $1 billion in 1910 represented nearly 3% of the entire United States' gross domestic product. In today's terms, it would be equivalent to owning roughly $400 billion. By 1900, Standard Oil controlled approximately 85% of American oil refining and 90% of oil distribution. This dominance bred resentment. In 1906, the federal government filed suit against Standard Oil under the Sherman Antitrust Act. In 1911, the Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil must be broken up into 34 separate companies. But in one of history's great ironies, the breakup made Rockefeller even richer. As the major shareholder in Standard Oil, Rockefeller received stock in all 34 successor companies. Between 1911 and 1920, the combined value of Rockefeller's holdings in these companies tripled. By 1916, His wealth peaked at an estimated $340 billion in current dollars. From his youth, Rockefeller had been taught that wealth came with moral obligations. Starting in the 1890s, he began systematic charitable giving on an unprecedented scale. He established the University of Chicago, created the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, and founded the Rockefeller Foundation with an initial endowment of $100 million. By the time he died in 1937 at age 97, Rockefeller had given away approximately $550 million, more than half of his peak wealth. Adjusted for inflation, his charitable giving exceeded $14 billion. When we call John D. Rockefeller the third richest person in history, we recognize his peak personal fortune of approximately $340 billion in current dollars. This represented approximately 1.5% of total American economic output at the time, a level of relative wealth that has never been matched. The caravan stretches beyond the horizon, a river of gold flowing across the Sahara Desert. Camels laden with precious metal move in perfect formation, their bells chiming in rhythm with their steps. At the head of this unprecedented procession rides a man whose wealth is so vast that chroniclers will struggle to describe it. He distributes gold with such casual generosity that the precious metal loses value across entire regions. His name will echo through history not for conquest, but for an act of religious devotion that accidentally reveals to the world the greatest fortune ever assembled. This is Mansa Musa, Emperor of Mali, embarking on a pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 that will establish him as the richest person who ever lived. To understand Mansa Musa's fortune, we must first understand the geography that made it possible. West Africa in the 14th century was blessed with a unique combination of natural resources and strategic position. Most importantly, the area controlled the source of two commodities that medieval societies valued above all others: gold and salt. Gold came from the Bambouk and Bure goldfields, regions so productive that they supplied much of the precious metal circulating in medieval Europe and the Islamic world. Salt was equally valuable, drawn from vast deposits in the Sahara. Between these two precious resources lay the Empire of Mali, perfectly positioned to control and tax the trade that connected them. The empire had been founded in the 13th century by Sundiata Keita. Under Sundiata and his successors, Mali grew into an empire that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the bend of the Niger River, encompassing dozens of ethnic groups, languages, and traditional kingdoms. Into this world of trade and empire, Musa ibn Abi Bakr was born around 1280. When he became Mansa around 1312, Musa inherited more than just political power. He inherited the accumulated wealth of generations of rulers who had successfully managed the world's most profitable trade routes. Under Musa's rule, Mali would reach heights of prosperity that would make his reign legendary across 3 continents. Mali's power rested on its position as intermediary between the gold-producing regions of the south and the salt mines of the north. But the empire's economic strategy was more sophisticated than simple taxation. Mali became the region's banker, providing credit for long-distance trade, standardizing weights and measures, and guaranteeing the safety of merchants. The capital, Niamey, evolved into one of medieval Africa's great commercial centers. But it was Timbuktu that became Mali's most famous city, a center of learning as well as commerce. The city's libraries contained hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Its scholars were renowned across the Islamic world. Under Musa's rule, this entire system reached peak efficiency. By 1320, Mansa Musa commanded resources that dwarfed those of any contemporary ruler. His personal holdings included vast gold mines, extensive agricultural estates, and commercial interests across West Africa. In 1324, Mansa Musa began preparations for the most spectacular pilgrimage in medieval history. Islamic law requires every Muslim who is able to undertake the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, at least once in their lifetime. But Musa's approach to the pilgrimage was characteristically extravagant. Chroniclers describe a caravan of 60,000 people, including soldiers, merchants, scholars, and servants. Hundreds of camels carried supplies for the months-long journey, but it was the gold that made this pilgrimage legendary. Musa brought an estimated 4 tons of gold on the journey, not as trade goods, but as spending money and gifts to be distributed along the way. In one famous account, he gave away so much gold in the Egyptian city of Cairo that the precious metal's value collapsed and didn't recover for more than a decade. Local chroniclers wrote that the city had never seen such wealth. The pilgrimage established Mansa Musa's reputation across the Islamic world and beyond. For the first time, medieval Europe became aware of the great wealth of West Africa. The famous Catalan Atlas of 1375 would depict Musa holding a golden nugget, with text describing him as the richest ruler in the world. The decade following Musa's return from pilgrimage marked the height of Mali's prosperity and power. The international attention generated by his spectacular journey brought new trading opportunities. Merchants from Cairo, Damascus, and even Venice established permanent operations in Mali's cities. Contemporary Islamic sources suggest that at its height, Mali's annual revenue approached 400 tons of gold, an almost inconceivable sum. In modern terms, this would represent hundreds of billions of dollars in purchasing power. But Musa's wealth went beyond mere precious metal. He controlled the agricultural output of the fertile Niger River Valley. He commanded the loyalty of armies that could field tens of thousands of warriors. He governed cities that were centers of international commerce and learning. Mansa Musa died around 1337 after ruling Mali for approximately 25 years. His death marked the end of the empire's golden age, though Mali would continue to be a major power in West Africa for generations. Modern economists have attempted to calculate his fortune in contemporary terms, with estimates ranging from $400 billion to over $1 trillion, making him potentially the richest person who ever lived. When we call Mansa Musa the second richest person in history, we recognize several different dimensions of his wealth. First was the sheer scale of his personal fortune. Contemporary sources suggest he controlled more gold than existed in the treasuries of all European kingdoms combined. But perhaps most importantly, Musa demonstrated that wealth could be built through peaceful commerce rather than military conquest. His empire showed that Africa was not peripheral to medieval world systems but central to the global networks of trade and learning that connected Europe, Asia, and Africa. The ships return at dawn, their hulls heavy with treasure. Cedar from Lebanon, gold from Ophir, precious stones from the ends of the earth. In Jerusalem, 70 miles inland, a man sits on a throne of ivory and gold, surrounded by wisdom and wealth beyond measure. He is Solomon, son of David, king of Israel and Judah. Under his rule, a small nation perched on the edge of great empires has become the commercial center of the ancient world. His wisdom is legendary, his wealth unparalleled, his kingdom a magnet for merchants, queens, and seekers of knowledge from across 3 continents. Solomon was born around 1000 BC into a world transformed by his father's conquests. David had taken the scattered tribes of Israel and forged them into a united kingdom. Through decades of warfare, he had expanded Israel's borders and captured Jerusalem, placing Israel at the crossroads of 3 continents. But David's kingdom was still essentially a military state. When Solomon inherited the throne around 970 BC, he faced a choice: continue his father's military campaigns or transform conquest into commerce. Solomon chose commerce, and that choice made him the richest man in the ancient world. Unlike his father, Solomon understood that Israel's greatest asset was not its armies, but its geography. The kingdom sat at the intersection of the ancient world's most important trade routes. Caravans traveling between Mesopotamia and Egypt had to pass through Israelite territory. Ships sailing between India and Europe often stopped at Israelite ports. Solomon's first great economic innovation was the development of a merchant marine. In partnership with Hiram, king of Tyre, he built a fleet of ships at Etzion-Geber on the Red Sea. These ships opened trade routes that had never before been available to his kingdom. They sailed to Ophir for gold, to India for spices and precious stones, to East Africa for ivory and exotic animals. According to biblical accounts, Solomon's fleet brought back 420 talents of gold from Ophir alone, roughly 16 tons of precious metal from a single expedition. His total annual income was said to be 66 talents of gold, plus silver, precious stones, and exotic goods that were literally beyond measure. Solomon's wealth was built on understanding what the ancient world truly valued. His kingdom controlled some of the ancient world's most important copper mines. More spectacularly, his trading expeditions brought back gold on a scale that amazed contemporary observers. The biblical account records that gold was so common in Solomon's court that silver was considered worthless. But precious metals were only part of the story. Solomon's traders brought back spices from India, ivory from Africa, silk from the East, cedar from Lebanon. Most importantly, Solomon controlled the trade routes themselves. Merchants traveling between major civilizations had to pass through his territory and pay his taxes. Rather than simply extracting tribute, Solomon created a commercial infrastructure that made trade more profitable for everyone involved. He built roads, established rest stops, provided security, and guaranteed honest weights and measures. Solomon's most famous building project was the Temple in Jerusalem, but his commercial infrastructure was equally impressive. At Megiddo, Hazor, and Gezer, he built chariot cities, fortified commercial centers that controlled the major trade routes through his territory. Archaeological evidence suggests Solomon maintained facilities for thousands of horses and hundreds of chariots. These were not just military assets, but commercial ones. Horses and chariots were among the ancient world's most valuable trade goods. Contemporary estimates of Solomon's wealth are staggering even by modern standards. His annual income of 666 talents of gold would be worth approximately $2 billion today just in gold content, not counting silver, precious stones, exotic goods, and other assets. Some modern economists have estimated Solomon's total wealth at over $2 trillion in contemporary purchasing power, making him potentially the richest person who ever lived. The most famous visitor to Solomon's court was the Queen of Sheba, whose journey has become legendary. According to biblical and Islamic sources, this mysterious queen traveled from her kingdom bringing with her 120 talents of gold, precious stones, and spices in very great abundance. But she came not just to bring tribute, but to test Solomon's legendary wisdom, and to see if the reports of his wealth were true. The Queen of Sheba's visit illustrates Solomon's position in the ancient world. By the mid-10th century BC, Jerusalem had become a destination for royalty from across 3 continents. Despite his vast resources, Solomon maintained the religious practices of his ancestors. His daily routine reflected the customs and values of ancient Near Eastern royalty. He rose each day in rooms paneled with cedar and decorated with gold. Morning audiences were elaborate affairs where petitioners, ambassadors, and merchants sought his attention. Meals were legendary in their abundance. According to biblical sources, Solomon's daily provisions included 30 measures of fine flour, 60 measures of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, plus deer, gazelles, and birds. However, Solomon's success contained the seeds of its own destruction. The wealth that made his reign so magnificent required enormous resources to maintain. When Solomon died around 931 BC, these tensions exploded. His son Rehoboam demanded even heavier taxes. The northern tribes rebelled and established their own kingdom. The united monarchy was permanently divided. When we call Solomon the richest person in history, we recognize not just his accumulated treasure, but his transformation of the ancient world's economic systems. His wealth was built on intelligence rather than inheritance, on commerce rather than conquest, on partnerships rather than domination. Solomon's commercial empire connected 3 continents in trade networks that facilitated prosperity across the ancient world. His court became a center of learning and culture that attracted the best minds of his age. His kingdom, however briefly, became a model of what human civilization could achieve when wisdom guided wealth. 3,000 years after his death, Solomon remains history's symbol of royal magnificence. But his deeper legacy is the proof that the greatest wealth is not what you possess, but what you enable others to achieve. From the steppes of Mongolia to the palaces of Jerusalem, we have journeyed through 3 millennia of human ambition and achievement. These 10 individuals accumulated wealth that staggers belief. Yet their stories reveal that riches have never meant just one thing, But perhaps the most remarkable discovery is this. The richest people in history were often those who understood that true wealth comes not from taking, but from creating. Not from conquest, but from connection. Not from accumulation, but from building systems that generate prosperity for generations. Solomon's trade routes enriched 3 continents. Rockefeller's oil industry powered the modern world. Augustus's empire brought peace and prosperity to millions. Their legacies remind us that the greatest fortunes are built not on the suffering of others, but on the creation of value that lifts everyone higher. In our modern world of technological innovation and global commerce, their examples remain relevant. For in the end, the question is not how much wealth we can accumulate, but what we choose to build with the resources we command. The richest person in history may have been Solomon, but the richest legacy belongs to all who use their wealth not just for themselves, but for the betterment of humanity. Sweet dreams, and may your own fortunes, however great or modest, be spent in pursuit of wisdom, justice, and the common good.